But before we get to Caroline, let's talk about Richard III, of all people. There's a great series, or a fascinating looking series, starts on Tuesday night on BBC Two. It's presented by Stacey Dooley. It's called DNA Family Secrets, and it stars my next guest, who is an expert in the field, and one of the family secrets that she will be trying to solve is the family secret of the Plantagenets, the royal family from way back when. The last of the Plantagenet kings was Richard III, who had a bit of a bad reputation. His remains, you may remember, not so long ago, were found, of all places, underneath a car park in Leicester. And my next guest has been part of a probe into his DNA, into his remains, a genome investigation that may reveal all sorts of things about this notorious king, and perhaps that he wasn't such a bad guy after all. Maybe that's a bit fanciful, but what a fascinating prospect that is. Let's welcome to the show Professor Turi King. She's a public engagement and genetics professor at the University of Leicester. Good morning, Turi.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. I think this looks really, really interesting. Now, you've been investigating the remains of Richard III, who was found on, I still can't believe he was found under a car park in Leicester. And this will reveal all sorts of things, we are told. Apart from his physicality, we may learn that whether or not he was bald. And intriguingly, we could perhaps look into some of the forces that drove his character. You know, what kind of a digestive system he had. Was he prone to violent aggression? Tell us about this. How can you glean all of these extraordinary facets of his personality and physicality from these remains?
Well, I have to say, first thing is that comes from an article in the Times, and the headline was, "Can we tell if Richard is a good king or a bad king?" And I was at pains, actually, in the article to say that DNA cannot tell you this kind of thing at all. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a clickbait headline. What I am doing...
I can't believe it. Journalists doing that. I can't believe it.
I know, right? No, so it's been it's a really, really interesting project. Obviously, we found his remains in 2012, and I led on the genetic analysis with a big team, which showed that these were the remains of King Richard III. And obviously now what we can do these days is we can actually look at entire genomes of ancient individuals.
Sorry to interrupt, sorry. What is a genome?
Okay. Yeah. So our genome is essentially all of the DNA that we have. Okay. So for things like identifying his remains, I didn't actually look at all of his DNA. I was looking at little sections that I could use to do the identification. But what I'm able to do now is I'm able to look at all of his DNA. So DNA from ancient remains is actually really, really damaged. It's very, very fragmented. So we didn't know if we could actually get, his entire genome back. But we could get pretty much all of it. And that allows us to look at all kinds of things. So I'm interested in things like, we know that there's probably a genetic component to scoliosis. So can we have a look and see if
his famous hunchback, yes?
Yeah, exactly. So Richard's famous for being a hunchback. So he wasn't kyphosis, he wasn't forward. This is a sideways curve of the spine, scoliosis. But there's thought to potentially be a genetic basis. So can we have a look at that? There's all kinds of things you can look at. Was he genetically predisposed towards things like heart disease? Was he lactose intolerant? Was he genetically predisposed towards baldness? But one of the things we definitely will not be able to say is whether or not he was a good guy or a bad guy, or whether he killed the princes based on his DNA. That's just not a possible thing to do.
I don't think we would imagine he could solve the crime of the murdering of the princes, which of course he is accused of in the Tower of London. So he died in 1485. So are you saying that you can't get any of his personality traits? I mean, it does seem to be a long shot to me, but the Times said that it may reveal his propensity towards violent aggression, psychopathy and narcissism. Is that true?
Well, it's more that, I mean, science, I'm not, but other scientists are looking into things like genes that seem to be associated with particular personality traits. But one of the really important things to say is that we are not just our DNA. Obviously, you could have genes that might be associated with a particular thing, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have that. And one of the things we're really finding out, and this has been in the last sort of few years, because even when I was growing up, it was thought that, one gene, one trait, one gene does eye color. We know that that's not the case now. It's almost like an orchestra. You can have the same genes involved in different pathways. Mm-hmm. So I kind of describe it like an orchestra. So it might be that there's a gene that seems to be involved in this particular pathway, and it may play a big role in that. It's like the trumpet, and it's got a solo. But it could be that in another piece of music, another pathway, it plays a relatively minor part. So we know that for a lot of traits, there's a really complex genetic basis with each little tiny gene, maybe adding a tiny, tiny bit to it. And then on top of that, you've got things like, well, how were you brought up? What did you eat? Were you living in poverty? Did you have enough food to eat? This kind of thing. All of that has an impact on your personality or any other trait, really.
Anything in your research that has really surprised you that you've discovered about Richard III?
Well, I think this came out at the time. So obviously when doing the genetic analysis and showing whether or not this is actually Richard III, because of how our DNA is inherited, I couldn't just use any old relative to do that comparison. You have to look at two pieces of DNA that are passed down through the generations in a really simple way. So this is mitochondrial DNA, which comes down through the female line because it's in the egg, and he matched his female line relatives. Richard doesn't have any descendants, but he has relatives. So I was able to match against the mitochondrial DNA relatives, but when looking at the male line relatives, so this is the Y chromosome, and it goes down through the male line. So a father passes it down to his son, down to his son, down through generations. If you looked at male line relatives of Richard III, it didn't match. Now, I wasn't hugely surprised about that because we know that it's called false paternity. So this is where the biological father is not the recorded father. So like illegitimacy, essentially. And there's 19 generations between Richard and the common ancestor of these male line relatives that I was testing. That's plenty of time for there to have been a false paternity, or more than one in that time. But it's interesting because if it's happened in particular parts of the tree, it could have an impact on the historical monarchy.
Can you take us back to actually the remarkable story of the discovery of King Richard III's remains beneath a car park in Leicester? How was he found? How did you come about pinpointing where this monarch from the 15th century was actually buried?
Well, so the site of where he was buried has never been lost. We know that he is supposed to have been buried in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars Friar. We know that from historical documentation. But the friary was actually torn down during the dissolution of the monasteries. So 1538, you get the monasteries are being torn down. So the precise location of where he had been buried had been lost, but where the friary, or at least the friary precinct was, hadn't. But it really was a huge amount of luck. So it was actually kicked off by, the whole project was kicked off by a lady called Philippa Langley from the Richard III Society, who rang us up and said, would you like to be involved? And so obviously the university put money in, the Richard III Society put money in, and we started this excavation. And Richard Buckley, who is actually oversaw the excavation, he's been, excavating in downtown Leicester for 30 odd years. What we did was we put two long, thin trenches down this car park in what was the Friary Precinct. And our main aim was, can we actually find anything from the friary? Can we find any walls? Can we find anything? 6 hours, 34 minutes in, we find a little bit of leg bone.
Wow. Well, that must have been a moment, wasn't it?
Well, but it wasn't, because you can't just excavate remains. You have to get a license from the Ministry of Justice. And what we say is we're going to lift up to 6 sets of remains, but we've got to be pretty intelligent about which ones we're going to go for. We're not going to go for the first 6 we find, because what if we don't know where we are. What if we've just come down in the graveyard? And next to this chap or this skeleton is, hundreds. And we're looking for a particular sort of skeleton, one that's probably got battle injuries because we know he died in battle. We know he's aged about 30. Well, he's 32 when he died, so we're looking for a skeleton around that age. We're looking possibly someone with a spinal abnormality because of the whole Shakespeare thing. But also there is a contemporary report which talks about him having one shoulder higher than the other. So that's the sort of skeleton that we're looking for. So we have just uncovered the leg bone, and Matthew Morse, who's our archaeologist on site, hops into the trench and he goes, yeah, there's an articulated skeleton under there, but we're going to leave it because we need to keep going because we know where Richard is supposed to be, which is in the choir of the church. Mm-hmm. And after about 2 weeks of excavating, we realized that, hey, that skeleton that we found on the very first day does look like it's down at one end of the choir. Let's go back and uncover that. Which we did.
And then your eureka moment. So can you reveal, Turi, was he bald?
Oh, I haven't looked at that, to be honest. Not yet.
But you are going to find out.
Well, I will look at all of these things. And the really nice thing about the project is I can get people who are experts in things like genes that are involved in heart disease, this kind of thing, people who are experts in looking at genes to do with scoliosis. So it's going to be a really nice big paper that looks at what we know now. But the other thing I like about it is that the lifetime of the project will go beyond our work on it because it will all become publicly available. So say in 10, 20 years' time, we have a better understanding of the genetic basis of a particular trait, then other people can go back and have a look at that.
I'll tell you what, Turi, you've got a fascinating job, and we will all be able to get a look at your fascinating job when you star in the BBC Two's DNA Family Secrets, which starts on Tuesday, I believe, at 9 p.m. Turi, what a fascinating look into the life and times of Richard III. Thank you so much for your time on a Sunday morning. Turi King, Professor of Public Engagement and Genetics at the University of Leicester there. When we come back, it's time for our show business bulletin with Caroline Frost. In the meantime, I remain Kevin O'Sullivan, and this is still Talk Radio.